The front door closed behind me with the softest click, and I stood in the entryway of the home I had decorated myself, listening to the man I had married plan the end of my life. I had not meant to come home early. The client meeting in the city had been canceled at the last minute, some emergency on their end. I had been standing on the curb outside their office at 1 p.m. with a bag of takeout coffee and a folder of swatches, and the cab driver had said where to, and I had said home without thinking. I had been thinking about the test, the 2 pink lines, the way my hand had shaken on the bathroom counter that morning when I had finally let myself believe it. 6 months we had been trying. I had taken 3 tests in 2 days to be sure. I had not told Daniel yet. I had been planning to tell him that weekend over the dinner I was going to cook, the one with the lamb he liked. I had been planning the moment in my head for 48 hours. I came in through the front door with my key. I closed it softly because the housekeeper was off on Tuesdays and I liked the quiet. I set my bag on the console table. I had my hand on my stomach without thinking, just resting it there, the way I had been doing for 2 days. Then I heard his voice. It was coming from the study, down the long hallway, the one I had picked the runner for. The door was cracked open. He was on speakerphone. I could hear his mother's voice too, thin and clear through the open door, and I should have walked into the kitchen and started the kettle and waited for him to come find me. That is what I should have done. But I heard my own name. Sophia, he was saying. She had her years, Mother. She had 4 good ones. I went still. His mother said something I did not catch. I know, he said. I know. Within the month, I will file. I did not move. She will not contest, he said. She is too proud. She will sign and disappear. You know how she is. His mother's voice came clearer through the speaker, sharp and certain. She was never one of us, darling. Vivian has waited long enough. There was a pause. I know, he said again, softer. I know. I stood in the hallway with my hand on my stomach. I did not cry. I want the record to show that. I did not cry. I did not gasp. I did not make any sound at all. I stood there, in the home I had picked every cushion for, and I listened to the rest of the call. He told her he had spoken to a lawyer already. He told her the prenup made it clean. He told her Vivian's father had asked, and the answer was yes, and the announcement could happen in the spring once the paperwork was done. He had been planning this for months. He had let me try for a baby with him for months. I picked up my bag. I walked back to the front door. I opened it the same way I had opened it 3 minutes earlier, and I stepped back outside into the afternoon, and I closed it behind me with the same soft click, and Daniel never knew I had come home. I did not go back, not that night and not the next. I checked into a hotel near the airport because it was the first one the cab driver suggested, and I did not want to pick. I sat on the edge of the bed in my coat, and I called Eleanor Holloway. Eleanor was the woman who had funded the seed round of my firm 3 years earlier, when the Crawfords had laughed at the idea of me running my own studio. She was 71 years old and the senior board member of Reed Holloway Hotels, the company that had been quietly trying to acquire pieces of Crawford hospitality for as long as I had been married. I had never used her name. I had never used the connection. I had never even told Daniel she was my mentor, because Daniel had never asked who funded my firm, and I had stopped offering information to people who did not ask. She picked up on the second ring. Sophia? I need to disappear, I said. She did not ask why. She said, when? Tonight. Where do you want to go? I had not thought about it. I had not thought about anything except the soft click of the door. "Somewhere he will not look," I said. "I have a place," she said. "I will call you in 20 minutes. I put the phone down. I sat there on the edge of the hotel bed and I put both hands flat on my belly, and I told my child, out loud in the empty room, that we were going to be all right. I told him I had heard everything. I told him I knew exactly what I was going to do. I had 2 years of recordings on my phone. I had started keeping them after the second family dinner where Margaret Crawford had told me, in front of everyone, that my dress looked like something a hostess would wear. I had told my therapist about it. My therapist had said, gently, that it might help me to record the dinners and listen back so I could hear that I was not imagining what they said. I had recorded every dinner since, every Christmas, every birthday, every charity event where Margaret had introduced me to her friends as Daniel's wife, the decorator. I had 2 years of audio. I had never planned to use it. I was going to use it now. The divorce papers arrived at Daniel's office 10 days later. I had signed them already. Eleanor's lawyer had drafted them. They were clean, simple, no contest. I had asked for nothing. I had taken my own savings, my own car, my own clothes. I had left him the house and the joint accounts I had quietly maintained separately for 4 years anyway. I had texted him once during those 10 days to say I was on a work trip in Milan, and he had replied, "Okay, safe travels." And that was the last thing he ever said to me as my husband. He signed within 3 hours of receiving the papers. I knew because Eleanor's lawyer told me. I was sitting in a rental in a city I had never lived in before, drinking tea, and the lawyer called and said, "It is done," and I said, "Thank you," and I hung up, and I went into the small bedroom I had set up as a nursery, and I sat on the floor next to the crib I had assembled myself, and I let myself cry for exactly 1 hour. Then I stopped. I had work to do. 3 years passed. I will not pretend they were easy. I had a son in a city where I knew no one. I had a firm to rebuild from a rented spare room. I had a body that took longer to recover than I expected, and a baby who did not sleep through the night until he was nearly 2, and a bank balance that gave me real fear in the months before Bennett Studios' first major commercial contract closed. But I had Eleanor, and I had Henry. Henry was born in March, healthy and loud, with dark hair and Daniel's eyes. I cried when I saw his eyes once in the hospital, and then I never cried about Daniel's eyes again. They were Henry's eyes now. Daniel did not get to keep any part of them. Eleanor came every week for the first 6 months. She brought groceries, she held the baby. She did not say anything sentimental. She told me what was happening at Reed Holloway. She told me Crawford Hospitality's quarterly numbers, which I read with detached interest, the way you read about the weather in a country you have left. She never asked me if I was sure. She never asked me if I missed him. She never used the word divorce or the word husband, and she never used Daniel's name. She brought me a kettle the second week because she had noticed I did not own one, and she stood at my counter and made me tea and said, "You are doing the work. The rest will come." I did the work. I worked while Henry slept. I worked when he was awake and laid on a blanket on the floor of the spare room I had turned into an office. I worked at 3 a.m. when he had been up since 2. I sent emails with one hand and rocked the bassinet with my foot. I took client calls in the bathroom with the fan running. I said yes to every contract I could deliver and no to every one I could not. And I learned the names of every fabric supplier within 6 hours of my new city, and I rebuilt the Rolodex I had walked away from in the home office Daniel had bought me as a wedding present. I did not look for Daniel online. I did not look for Vivian. I did not look at any photographs of the wedding I knew was being planned without me. I did not allow myself the indulgence of curiosity. The window of my new apartment looked out over a row of plane trees, and in the mornings, I watched the leaves change instead. Daniel and Vivian were married 8 months after our divorce. There was a piece in a society magazine. I read it in a coffee shop with Henry asleep in the carrier on my chest. Margaret Crawford was quoted as saying the family was complete at last. I felt nothing. I closed the magazine. I went back to work. The firm's first major commercial contract closed when Henry was 11 months old. I cried in the parking lot of the bank after I deposited the retainer. Then I drove home and made him spaghetti, which he wore more of than he ate. And I took a photo of his face covered in sauce, and I sent it to Eleanor with no caption. And Eleanor sent back a photo of her own dinner, also spaghetti. And that was the closest thing to a celebration I had. I did not need a bigger one. I had Henry. I had work. I had a quiet apartment with plane trees outside. I had a kettle and a kitchen that was mine, and a routine that was mine, and a body that had carried a child alone and was beginning, slowly, to feel like my own again. By the time Henry was 2, Bennett's studio had a real office, 6 employees, and a waiting list. By the time he was 2.5, Reed Holloway had hired me to design the interiors of their new flagship in the city. That was how Marcus Reed walked into my office. He was 35. He was a senior executive at Reed Holloway, reporting directly to Eleanor. He had met me once, 5 years earlier, at an industry event Daniel had dragged me to, and Daniel had introduced him as a hotelier, not our level. I had forgotten him. He had not forgotten me. He came to discuss the flagship project. He sat across from me in the small conference room of my new office in a navy suit that fit him the way clothes fit a man who did not think about them. And he talked through the project brief without looking at his notes once. He asked questions I had to think about. He listened to the answers without interrupting. He did not flatter me, and he did not condescend to me. And at the end of the meeting, he stood up and shook my hand and said the work was good and the timeline was right, and Reed Holloway was lucky to have us. He stayed 40 minutes longer than the meeting required. He noticed Henry's drawing taped to my office wall. He asked his name. When I said Henry, Marcus smiled, just a little, and said, "Good name." He did not ask about the father. He came back the next week with revised plans. The week after that, he came back with coffee. The week after that, he stayed an hour after the meeting ended, sitting on the floor of my office with Henry, who had been brought in by my assistant when daycare closed early, building a tower out of fabric samples I had stopped using. Henry, who had never been alone in a room with a man other than his pediatrician, did not seem to know he was supposed to be shy. By the 3rd month, I knew he was not going to leave, and I had to decide whether I was going to let him stay. I let him stay. Marcus was the opposite of Daniel in every way that mattered. He listened. He noticed. He asked Henry questions and waited for Henry to answer. He did not need to be the most important person in the room. He was the most important person in the room, without trying. He never asked me about my marriage, and I never told him. And one evening, about a year in, he said quietly, "Whoever he was an idiot." And I knew he had figured it out, and I let it sit there. He met Eleanor for dinner once a month, the way he had been doing since he started at Reed Holloway, and he never asked me what we talked about, and I never asked him. He brought me dinner on the nights I worked late. He learned how Henry liked his apple slices cut. He showed up. He kept showing up. He did not ask me to call him anything I was not ready to call him, and the first time Henry called him by name, all on his own, in a grocery store on a Saturday morning, Marcus did not make a thing of it. He just answered. I never said Daniel's name in that house. The encounter happened 6 weeks before the gala. I was at the rooftop bar of the Halsey Hotel, finalizing a contract with a client, when Vivian Ashford walked in. She saw me from across the room. I watched her see me. I watched her face do the small calculation of recognition and surprise, and I watched her decide to come over. She was wearing white. She always wore white. It had been her costume for as long as I had known her. Sophia, she said, with the smile she used at charity events. I had no idea you were still in the industry. I never left. Of course. She tilted her head. I just meant after everything. I thought you might have moved on to something quieter. I looked at her. I let the silence sit for 2 beats longer than was comfortable. I have been very busy, I said. She glanced at my hand. She was looking for a ring. She did not find one. Daniel will be sorry he missed you, she said, softer now, the smile thinner. Will he? She blinked. I picked up my coffee. I gave her the smallest nod. I went back to my client, and I did not look at her again. She told Daniel that night. Eleanor heard about it within 48 hours, because Eleanor heard about everything. She called me and said, She is asking questions now. Margaret is asking questions. Let them ask, I said. Eleanor said, The gala is in 6 weeks. I said, I know. The Crawford Hospitality Group annual gala was held in the marble ballroom of their flagship hotel, the one Daniel's grandfather had built, the one where Margaret Crawford received guests like a queen receiving her court. I arrived at 9 o'clock. I was wearing midnight blue. The gown was simple, expensive, cut perfectly. My hair was up on one side, loose on the other, the way I had worn it the first night Daniel had taken me to dinner, 8 years earlier, when I had still believed him. Marcus was on my right. Henry was on my left, holding my hand. He was almost 3. He was wearing a small black suit Eleanor had picked out. He was holding my hand because I had told him there would be a lot of grown-ups and he should stay close. And he had nodded seriously the way he nodded at all instructions. We walked into the ballroom together. Daniel saw Marcus first, across the floor, and his expression flickered with the recognition of a competitor. Then he saw me, and then his eyes dropped, and he saw the small boy at my side, and he saw Henry's face, and time stopped in the room around him. I watched it happen. I watched the champagne tilt in his hand. I watched his lips part. I watched him go pale under the chandelier light. I watched Vivian beside him notice his face and follow his gaze, and I watched her see Henry too, and her smile froze in place like a photograph someone had forgotten to put down. Margaret Crawford was at the entrance. She had been receiving guests. She turned when the room turned, and her eyes found me, and she crossed the ballroom in 8 steps. Sophia, she said, low. What are you doing here? I was invited. By whom? By me, said Eleanor, stepping in beside me, smiling the way she smiled in board meetings. Sophia is my guest, Margaret, and her son. You remember meeting Marcus, I am sure. Margaret looked at Eleanor. Eleanor looked back. I would like a word, Margaret said to me very quietly. In private. No, I said. Here is fine. The room had begun to listen. Not all of it, not yet. Just the closest 15 people, the ones who had felt the temperature change. They were watching now without seeming to watch. Margaret's voice dropped to a whisper. "You have a child." "Yes." "Whose child?" "Mine." Her jaw tightened. "Sophia, I am asking you a question." I heard the question. Daniel had crossed the floor. He stopped 2 feet from me. His eyes were on Henry. Henry was looking up at him with the curious blank gaze of a child who has been told to stay close to his mother and is doing exactly that. "How old is he?" Daniel said. I did not answer. "Sophia, how old is he?" I took my phone out of my clutch. I did not raise my voice. I did not turn it on or play anything aloud. I held it in my hand where Margaret could see it. "I have 2 years of recordings from your dinners," I said to her. "I have you, on tape, in your dining room, telling your husband I was a poor investment. I have you telling Vivian's mother that I was a placeholder. I have you, the night before my engagement party, telling Daniel that he was making a mistake, but the mistake was reversible. I have all of it." Margaret's face went gray. "And I have," I said, "the call he took in his study 3 years ago. The one where he agreed to file within the month. The one where you told him I was never one of you. I have that one too." The 15 people had become 30. Daniel's mouth was open. "Sophia," he said, and his voice cracked on the word. "Whose child is he?" I looked at Henry. I looked back at Daniel. I gestured to Marcus, who knelt down beside Henry and said, "Hey, buddy, want to go see the fountain in the lobby? Eleanor's going to take us." Henry nodded. Eleanor took his other hand. They walked away together, the 3 of them, and the room watched them go. I turned back to Daniel. "His name is Henry," I said. "He is 2 years and 8 months old. He was born 6 months after I left. I was pregnant the night I came home early and stood in the hallway and listened to you tell your mother I had had my years." Daniel made a sound. It was not a word. "You signed the papers in 3 hours," I said. "You did not ask why I was leaving. You did not call. You did not write. You did not look for me. You were relieved. You told yourself I was too proud to fight, and you went and married the woman your mother always wanted. So no, he is not your child. He is mine." Vivian had reached us. She put a hand on Daniel's arm. "Daniel, let's go." I looked at her. "You have been a placeholder for 8 years," I said. "You waited that long. You will not have him for another 8. She let go of his arm. Daniel was crying. He was actually crying, in a tuxedo, in the marble ballroom of his grandfather's hotel, in front of 45 of the most important people in the city. He was reaching for me. He was saying my name. He was saying he had not known. He was saying he had been a fool. He was saying he had thought about me every day for 3 years. I let him say it. I let him say all of it. When he was done, when the words had run out and he was just standing there with his hands open, I leaned in close, the way I had leaned in at our wedding, and I said, very quietly, so only he could hear, "You had your years, Daniel. You had 4 good ones. They were all I had to give." I stepped back. I walked across the ballroom to the lobby, where Eleanor and Marcus and my son were waiting. Henry held out his arms to me. I picked him up. He put his head on my shoulder. The weight of him was the most familiar thing in the world. We went home. Bennett Studios' new flagship office opened 5 months after the gala. It was on the top floor of a converted textile building in the design district, all warm brick and tall windows and afternoon light. I had picked the building myself. I had picked everything in it. Crawford Hospitality became consultative within 2 quarters. Daniel was not the CEO anymore. He was a name on the letterhead. The board had asked him to step back, citing personal circumstances. The personal circumstances were that the recordings had reached the press within 3 weeks of the gala, anonymously, through a route I did not arrange but did not regret, and Margaret Crawford had not been seen at an industry event since. Vivian called off the engagement publicly. She married a man 20 years older than her within a year. I did not follow it. Marcus moved in 8 months after the gala. He did not propose for another year. When he did, he asked Henry first. Henry said yes before I did. I sat at my desk on a Tuesday afternoon in late autumn, watching the sun move across the floorboards, and I heard the elevator open and Marcus's voice and Henry's voice answering. Henry was telling Marcus about a turtle he had drawn at school. Marcus was asking the right questions about the turtle. They came in together. Henry ran to me. I lifted him onto my lap. Marcus laughed at something Henry said. Henry laughed back. I put my hand on my son's hair. I had spent 4 years of my life building a marriage out of forgiveness, and one afternoon in a hallway, I had learned that forgiveness without honesty is just a place to hide. I had walked out of that house with nothing. 3 years later, I walked into the largest ballroom in the city with my son, and the people who had taken everything from me had nothing left to take. I had not become cruel. I had only stopped being available. That, in the end, was the only revenge I needed.